All right, what's up, everybody? Happy to be presenting today talking about privacy. I think it is one of these peripheral GRC topics that is going to just keep coming back up. Excited to address it today and kind of get into the nitty gritty a little bit with y'all, but also maybe introduce it to some folks who might be wondering what all this stuff is about. Why is it so important that we have like a whole separate stream for it and all of that? So thanks for joining. Say throw some questions in the chat if you've got them, and I'll try to move through these slides as quickly as I can. All right. All right. For starters, I believe privacy is a fundamental human right. It is not necessarily the case that everybody believes that. It's still a little bit contentious here in the US, but I believe it's a fundamental human right. It's often aligned with the right to just be left alone, the right to be anonymous, and uh, yeah, the right to maintain your seclusion. So when we talk about it in the business context, it does have to do with individuals and how they're able to control their information, who has access to that information, what they've actually consented to and have allowed you to do with that information, and then what is the and for what purposes. Usually it has to be for a specific purpose. So I bring that up just to start out with the definition to say that as GRC folks, it is something that comes up a lot. And as you advance in your career, we do have to start talking about these hairy problems, like what is this big issue that you're going to take on in career? What are you going to be the sort of SME at? What are you going to be an expert at? How are you going to differentiate yourself in the job market, and find something that you're excited to come to work at come to work and talk about, and it's challenging enough that really keeps you motivated. Having that hairy problem, I felt like privacy was pretty apt for that in terms of my what I understood about it, and so I kept digging deeper and deeper and finding more and more about it, and that's how I ended up here. Also, it is just one of these things, like when you're always going to come back to this idea of trust. So if you're able to show how, from a privacy or compliance perspective, even similar to a security perspective, as when we know that our customers can trust us, they're going to, of course, be more willing to give information, of course, be more willing to spend more dollars with us. So if you listen to that and you're like, duh, privacy and GRC go together, this might be something that you might want to dig into a little bit further. You're also going to find in a lot of job descriptions and things, or duties of a privacy analyst, that risk management, awareness training, a lot of these issues that we deal with as security analysts in GRC, they also carry over to privacy a bit as well. And I like to think of it as having a more of like a microscope. Instead of it being a whole other different issue, I'm looking at what we're doing on the security end with a microscope to see how we're handling people's personal information. This also might be a good fit for you if you don't mind dealing with these regulations, if you don't mind getting granular with what is actually happening with them, what all the details, looking through big documents. These are things you have to do anyway, but in a way that also takes on the responsibilities that you have to protect when it comes to people's rights. If you work for a company that covers several states or a region of a group of states, or if you're working for a global company, I think this is something to keep in mind, even maybe for potential roles in your existing company. And if you're working in finance, if you're at a publicly traded company, if you're working in healthcare, all these companies that deal with this sensitive information, sometimes you might be working for like a data broker or something that really privacy is going to be a big issue all the time. Or you're working for a legal firm, like legal tech is a big field, and they need folks that know what they're doing as well. Finally, I'll just say that as these regulations get more and more complex, they're adding more things to them, and they're kind of bringing the field together. So we do see regulations where you have both a privacy and a cybersecurity requirement. And so they're kind of being merged anyway. So if you're thinking about the future of your career, I would encourage you to start thinking about privacy a little bit before it's put on your plate. I encourage you to look at it now instead of later. So to talk about privacy a little bit more in detail, like for me, again, I said I think of it as a magnifying glass, but I think if you start to get a little bit more deeper, we are talking about the processing of data, and that is a little bit different responsibility than what you have in cybersecurity. So you do have some responsibilities to the individuals that give you their information, and how you deal with that has an impact on the organization as a whole. So these are some clips from the NIST 850 that we talked about recently that talks all about cybersecurity training, privacy training, building this culture of security and privacy in your companies. And I think that Venn diagram is a little misleading. I think that middle section is a little bit bigger than they sort of let on here, but it is important to have an idea how they relate and then maybe where they sort of start to depart. And so to give you an idea, that what I would encourage you to think about is what happens when, let's say, we work for this important social media company. You can pick one, and people love to give us their information. Maybe they give us too much information. We just have that much trust with them. But now we figured out a way that we're gonna have some new app, some new feature where we're gonna collect more information. Maybe we want to add to our website, we want to add a dating section. We're going to let people find their spouse, right? But we need to collect more data from them. And so you, as a privacy professional, or if you're doing what I call like value mill GRC, where you're in a GRC role, but you're also, it's such a small company, or you have so many responsibilities that maybe you get some privacy responsibilities pushed on you. You also have to consider what are the repercussions for us launching this new product, for us introducing this new feature that's going to be processing people's data. So here are the FIPS principles. Sometimes you see these, you see the GAP principles. There are all these considerations that we might not necessarily see in our frameworks with cybersecurity, but they really kind of lay the groundwork for privacy. So limiting collection of information, thinking about what is the purpose of that information, how was it used, and are we being transparent about that? And you see the security safeguards is a component of that as well. So I'm sure in the privacy stream, our Tuesday videos, we'll be talking about these in more detail, but this is to kind of give you an idea of what you'll be considering in a sort of privacy role, or even an expanded GRC role. There are frameworks, there are guidelines. We're not doing this blindly. We do have the NIST privacy framework to give us an idea of how to put together a privacy program. And we even see, I was talking about convergence earlier, we even see where, for example, 853 in the original revision 4, privacy was kind of this addendum kind of way at the back where you had to go check, some of the last pages to really see what were those controls. Well, now it has really been integrated into revision 5, and when you look in there, you still see that, okay, those security control baselines they don't fit into the baselines because there are some other considerations that that I was talking about. For example, how that we consider data processing that aren't necessarily cybersecurity concerns. So there's a lot of guidance on it. There is that personal information family that I'm sure we'll be discussing with PBO and crew soon. But yeah, there are guidelines to consider and dig a little bit deeper, and even talking about the sensitivity of data. If we're dealing with military data, if we're dealing with biometric data, if we're dealing with something very sensitive, what are the levels of controls that we're going to be putting in place? So some things that a privacy analyst might be doing, again, some of them might sound familiar. When I asked you to consider whether or not a new application to your social network was going to create issues for people's rights, for their privacy, that is often what we have to do in a privacy assessment, or sometimes privacy impact assessment. These are a whole flavor of risk assessments that we do in particular for privacy. So yeah, you see on privacy impact assessment, you might see data protection impact assessment. They have a bunch of different flavors, even specifically some for GDPR, where we talk about a legitimate interest assessment, whether we actually have a legitimate interest to be processing people's data. So if you have those skills for risk assessment, if you know that, okay, this this particular processing issue is such a big concern that maybe it also needs to appear in my risk registry as a real danger to the business. If you know you need to connect it there, if you know from the privacy end, you might need to connect it with your privacy policy. Like, oh, if we're going to collect that information, we need to update our privacy policy, our terms of service, and let people know what exactly we're doing. These are going to be some common roles. I've even seen job descriptions where your whole job is only doing privacy impact assessment. That doesn't sound like a lot of fun, but if you're really nerdy about this stuff, this could be really important to your job. You're going to be dealing with a lot of policy development, same way you would be in your GRC roles, compliance monitoring, where you're doing. I feel like this is a little bit different from GRC. In GRC, we kind of have to know about the new laws where when they come out. Where in privacy, you're actually considering them sometimes even when they're in draft. So maybe for folks who follow like CMMC or something, where you see this sort of draft rule come out and there's a public discussion about it. Maybe you're a little bit familiar with that, but I would say most of us trying to get into GRC, or most of us in our early GRC roles, you might haven't had the chance to really deal with those sort of issues just yet. Where in privacy, you might need to be tracking it from the beginning, like it's just a draft at the moment, but this might really impact our business. What are we going to do about it? Who do we need to talk to? You have to start pretty early on, and typically you might even have a whole legal team that's tracking that and asking questions about it pretty early on. That in particular is the case with our state privacy laws in the US. Data subject rights is also a departure from GRC. It is where as you collect people's data, you have to give them access to that data. You might have to give them access to view that data. You might have to give them access to correct that data, to restrict how you use it, to make sure that you're not selling it, or to even be able to request that their data is deleted. Now, this is important for us to know personally, so that we can go back to companies and say, hey, give me my data back. But it's also important if you're considering a privacy role where you have to reply to people's requests. A lot of times, especially for like GDPR, you only have a certain time window that you have to reply to people's requests and give them that data so that they can take it to another company, or they can remove it completely. Training and awareness is going to come up as a big issue all the time. Just really, I think it's a important one as a touch point for speaking to your teams, your companies, talking to your product team, uh, even your IT and security teams about how we handle people's data. Yeah, so that one's going to come up and have definitely be a corollary to what we see in security. And I think another big bridge is how we deal with vendors. So a lot of those early GRC roles, you might see them focusing in on third-party risk management, where sometimes your whole role might just be looking at questionnaires, sending them out, or maybe even receiving them, working with the team that's deciding whether or not to bring on a new tool or not. And in the same way, the privacy person might also have some of those responsibilities, especially if you have a tool. And of course, in the age of AI, that is going to be processing the data that people have given in your company. You're going to want to know, how is the vendor using it? What are they going to do with it? Are all of the categories of personal information that they're using really necessary for what they need to do? And then also that's when we're coming in, and I think especially privacy analysts with that security background, we're also looking at like, well, how secure is that organization? Do they have a culture of security there? Do they have some sort of attestation from SOC 2, ISO, or someone that makes them reputable? And with that said, I'll kind of talk a little bit about the IAPP and what they do. They are the largest organization of privacy professionals. This is where we get our certifications. This is where you see a lot of conferences and webinars and things really happening in the privacy field. As a warning, I will say it is very legal related. You see a lot of privacy lawyers that are often the ones who are the sort of loudest voices about privacy, but that is changing. It is getting more diverse, and we're also seeing a lot of even certifications that are specifically for people who might be in the risk management. So you see the CIPM there, which is the privacy manager role. This is the first certification that I got. When I looked at the requirements, and I'll I'll pop them on the screen in a moment. When I looked at the requirements for the exam, I saw that there was a lot of overlap there between um, exams that I had taken and passed and what I knew about risk management in my experience. So I targeted that one first, and then when I took that test, passed, got some confidence, I also turned to the CIPP, and that has a couple of different versions. It has a US version, a Europe version. They have a version for China as well, and maybe one or two other versions. But I had a hard time deciding if I wanted to focus in on Europe or the US, and I started to look at the materials available and really went for the US instead, especially when I knew there were other people in the group. I found out that Chris was studying for the CIPP US as well, and I really started to get into the Discord and ask questions and see if we could get study together. I will also mention that they have added the AI certification, and that's one I'm interested in the future. But I just wanted, yeah, just to point out how I was choosing those. Like I was looking at is this a topic I'm really interested in? Is it difficult? Is it a heavy lift? I like to find, like, I don't want to take all the tests that a certification program offers. Like, I don't want to do all the CompTIA stuff. I want to go for the most difficult exam, and that sounds a little bit masochistic and crazy, but I think it also gives you, like, if you really want to advance your career, you really want to have an idea like what all exists in the field. That's a good way to think about it. I think PBO, we talk about lifting heavy. So if you hear us talking about the CISSP and these other tests, I like to point to them because I think compared to the privacy test, and again, all tests are difficult, but I really feel like the security tests, a test like the CISSP, they're so at such an intense level that when you go back to these privacy certifications, that you almost feel like a little bit relieved. That's definitely been my experience. How employable are you with those certifications? Of course, a certification alone is not going to get you employed, but how does it look for in that particular field? And I found that these certifications for privacy roles in particular, and privacy can be just as crowded and competitive as cybersecurity. So it's not a cure-all, but they're really important. And a lot of times you see people that have multiple certifications. And then finally, how freely available is the info, and that is something I considered with both the CIPM and the CIPP-US. I also wanted to give you guys an idea like what those requirements actually look like. So these are the main topics. Like on the IAPP website, they have a body of knowledge. When you go to study for the exam, it gives you like a breakdown of a range of how many questions are going to be in a particular category. And so you have a look here. If you see in the middle, that middle row is the CIPM. And so I went and started looking at that, and I said, oh, this is basically testing you on the importance of privacy, how to set up a privacy program, and then they have the life cycle of privacy from starting out, like assessing data. That's really similar to what we do on the security end when we talk about, like, if you don't know what assets you have, how can you protect them? It's a similar situation in privacy. So I started there because it is a manager test. I felt like some of the feedback I got, people felt a little funny, like, hey, why are you taking the manager test first? But so I kind of did it probably backwards from what other people would do. And then I went to the CIPP US, and I feel like the toughest part is probably the last section in that first row that you see, the state privacy laws, because they're always in flux. They're making additions to them, they're making changes to them. Being able to answer questions about them can be a little bit nerve-wracking. So I will tell you guys, get into the group, find a community, discuss this with people. Don't just try to, you're not going to make it just memorizing state laws on that particular section of the test. After getting on here and really almost feeling like I didn't know anything, and talking to Chris, talking to PBO, talking to everybody that jumped on a call to talk privacy stuff, I ended up getting 100% on the state privacy law section of that particular exam. So not easy to do, and I think that's, yeah, definitely something to think about. Okay, the last column is for the privacy technologists. So just to give you an idea, if you have some sort of engineering background, if you're really interested in how the product process, how these products deal with data and how to protect that data, I think that might be a good exam to consider as well. And they're all expensive. So just to point out here, this is that top row is the cost of the exam. The middle is the membership, and then once you're a member, you do the exams for a little bit of a discount. So when I looked at that compared to trying to have an ISACA certification and a CompTIA certification and hop between all of those, plus my interest in privacy, I decided like, okay, this would be a worthwhile investment for me. And so um, I took my first exam, and then probably 2 months after I passed the CIPM, I went ahead and took the CIPP US. So you definitely need to invest about $1,000, I would say, into that. That's not including all the books and materials and stuff. So I would say both of the exams that I took, there were affordable resources in them, and that helped me keep the cost low. I want, again, in the interest of transparency, I know we talk on and on about certifications, if they're worth it, how expensive they are. But yeah, just to give you an idea, those from the jump. And you do not have to, of course, you do not have to take the exams to really sort of start looking into these a little bit more closely. But I did want to point this out, and feel free to, ping me and ask more questions, especially if you're interested in that last one, because I think in the new year, that's going to be one that I start to look at a little bit more closely. All right, that's privacy in a nutshell. That's a little bit about how I got interested in privacy, why I think it's so important. Even in the news today, we're seeing things about how people's privacy rights are being violated and causing all these issues. So I'm excited to discuss this stuff with you, answer your questions, and maybe get a couple other folks interested in privacy roles, and those certifications. Thanks so much.